Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on new developments in microwave materials measurements. My name is Rebecca Wilson, and I am the Marketing and Communications Manager at Copper Mountain Technologies. I'd like to introduce our presenter today. We are glad to have Dr. John Schultz, Chief Scientist at Compass Technology Group, where he leads research and development efforts in RF materials and measurement technology. Previously, he was a technical fellow at the Georgia Tech Research Institute, where he led programs in experimental and computational research on the electromagnetic properties of materials, structures, and antennas. He has developed materials characterization methodologies via free space, waveguide, resonant cavity, and impedance analysis instrumentation. He has also modeled electromagnetic composite materials and developed new composite material concepts for novel antenna applications. Dr. Schultz's backscatter methodologies have become an accepted standard method for characterizing diffuse microwave scatter in numerous government and industrial laboratories. I know you all will enjoy the content he has prepared for you today. Before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know that a recording of this webinar will be released later, so you can access and download it after we have concluded the webinar. You can expect that email around middle of next week. During the webinar, we would love to hear from you as we go along. If you have a question, you can type it in the message in the chat and select Q&A, and at the end of the webinar, we will go through and answer your questions. If you just joined us, welcome to our webinar on new developments in microwave material measurements. Now I'll let Dr. Schultz take it away. Welcome, Dr. Schultz.
All right, thank you very much. So I guess let's get started. So this is a fairly broad audience, so I've kind of divided this talk into three different sections. We're going to start with some fundamental concepts, very quickly review some terminology, and then we'll do a quick review of some of the conventional methods that folks have used over the last few decades for measuring microwave properties of materials. And then the meat of this webinar is going to be about some of the new and kind of exciting techniques and technologies that have been emerging for doing materials measurements and that have allowed us to do material measurements on types of materials that we couldn't do before, or in frequency ranges and sizes that we couldn't do before. So beginning with some fundamentals, the first sort of concept I want to get across is this idea of intrinsic versus extrinsic. So an intrinsic property is something that is independent of a specimen's size or shape. It's kind of what a material is. And so when I talk about intrinsic properties, I'm talking about the dielectric permittivity or the magnetic permeability or derivative properties from those, things like conductivity or sheet impedance. In terms of what is extrinsic, extrinsic is something that does depend on the size and shape of a specimen. So it's basically how a material behaves, rather than what a material is. So something like the transmission coefficient or the reflection coefficient or attenuation or some other related parameter. Those are extrinsic parameters. And what we do in materials measurements laboratories generally is we measure extrinsic properties, and then we use some math and physics to try to derive the intrinsic properties of a material based on the extrinsic properties. So let's talk about some of those intrinsic properties in a little more detail. The first one I want to talk about is the dielectric permittivity. The dielectric permittivity is a description of how a material interacts with the electric field from an incident wave. And when we talk about permittivity, it's a complex number, and I've got an equation up on the left side here of the complex dielectric permittivity, the relative permittivity. And there are two terms. Epsilon prime is the real part, and that's what most people think of as the dielectric constant. Epsilon double prime is the imaginary part, and that's why it has an I in front of it. And it is what tells us how a material absorbs energy, or basically sucks energy out of the electric field when there's a microwave field incident. Another definition you commonly see is loss tangent, and that equation is written there, tan delta, and it's really just the ratio of the imaginary part over the real part, and it's really just another way of describing how a material absorbs energy. Finally, you also have conductivity, which is directly related to the imaginary part of the permittivity. You can see an equation there where sigma, the conductivity, is proportional to the imaginary permittivity. And so it's related directly to absorption or loss in the material. The cartoons on the right kind of give some pictures of how materials interact with the electric field. The top picture shows an example of dipole relaxation. So that picture is kind of showing something similar to a polymer. So there's a chain of, say, carbon atoms, and then hanging off that chain are some other atoms that are part of the polymer. And what will happen is that those carbon atoms have a certain affinity for electrons. And then if there's a different atom, an oxygen or something like that, hanging off the carbon, it may have a different affinity. It may more strongly or weakly attract electrons. And so what happens is that within that chain, you'll have regions where there's a net positive charge and other regions where there's a net negative charge. And that charge separation is what we call a dipole moment. And so those dipoles are what strongly interact with the electric field in an incident wave. And so when you have an incident wave coming through, those dipoles are what drive that. And that's really what drives the dielectric constant in different types of materials. The cartoon on the bottom shows an example of conduction. Something like this might be a metal or even a ceramic, where you have a lattice of atoms. And you may have, in something that's conductive or semiconductive, you may have some electrons that are free to move around. And so those electrons basically bounce around the lattice. And when they hit a nuclei, they change direction. And so they sort of slow down. And that's a loss mechanism. So you can have resistive materials where those electrons are basically doing a lot of bumping around and are slowed down when going from one position to the next. The next class of intrinsic properties I want to describe are the magnetic properties, namely magnetic permeability. Permeability is also a complex number. There's a real part, mu prime, and an imaginary part, mu double prime. And just like with the permittivity, mu prime is sort of a magnetic constant, equivalent to the dielectric constant, and mu double prime is the magnetic loss. You also have a loss tangent defined for permeability, which is, again, the ratio of the imaginary over the real. Now, one of the things interesting about magnetic permeability is that there's only a few materials that actually have significant permeability. Most materials do not. Most materials have a relative mu of 1. Those few materials that do have magnetic permeability have it because they have what's called an unpaired electron. So what gives a material permeability is this quantum mechanical effect in electrons called spin. And the cartoon on the top right shows a couple of pictures of electrons and kind of giving you that idea of spin. And in most materials, you'll have electrons in the outer shell of your atoms, and those electrons tend to pair up. And when they pair up, the spins cancel each other out, and there's no net magnetic permeability. But in some materials, such as iron and nickel and sometimes cobalt, you may have unpaired electrons, which don't have an associate electron next to them to cancel out the spin. But that's what causes permeability. Now, the bottom cartoon shows an example of what's called magnetic domains. And that's materials that have magnetic permeability. The unpaired electrons in a certain microscopic region may all sort of align up into a similar direction. And that's what that picture shows. It shows electron spins from neighboring atoms all sort of pointing in the same direction in a region. And then in some other region, they're pointing in another direction. And of course, when you interact with a magnetic field, those magnetic domains move around. The boundaries of those magnetic domains move, the spins themselves may move, and that's what causes magnetic permeability, both the real part and then, of course, loss, magnetic loss as well. So those are the intrinsic parameters that we usually are trying to find when we're doing material measurements. These are the techniques that we typically use to determine extrinsic properties, which we then use to then calculate the intrinsic properties. So I have 4 different sort of categories of techniques that are commonly used. The first one is transmission line. That's a technique where you have a vector network analyzer, and then it's hooked up to typically some sort of waveguide. And then you have a material inside that waveguide, and you measure transmission and reflection. So in that technique, you have to have sort of precise samples to fit inside the waveguide. And then you have to have, if you want to do broad frequency coverage, you have to have different size waveguides to cover the different frequency bands. The second category that I'm going to talk about briefly is impedance analysis. Impedance analysis is a low frequency technique. So you can use either a network analyzer or a vector voltmeter to do impedance analysis. And this is a technique where you create a circuit element and you measure the properties of that circuit element and then use some math and physics to get permittivity or permeability. Third category is cavities. A cavity is a technique that you use with a network analyzer generally. These are narrow frequency techniques where you create a resonance in some structure and you insert your material and you see how that resonance changes, and that allows you to determine properties. Cavities can operate at very low frequencies or very high frequencies. The final category is free space techniques. A free space measurement system will also use network analyzers. It's a very broadband technique in general. The disadvantages are that you use larger samples, but the advantages are that you have minimal sample preparation. So I'm going to show you a slide on each of these techniques here, give you a little more detail. But first, let me talk about all these techniques in general. All these techniques, if you sort of step back and take a look at them from a bird's eye view, they all kind of have three main components. The first is the sensor or the fixture, some sort of geometric shape or apparatus that you mount a sample in and that radiates energy and that interacts with that sample. So that's kind of shown with the pentagon on the right side of the cartoon here. There's a microwave analyzer, usually a network analyzer, but can sometimes be something else like a vector voltmeter. That's the red box. And then usually you have to connect your analyzer to your fixture. So there's almost always some sort of RF cable or connection. So this is sort of the elements that you see in all material measurement fixtures. So let's talk about each of those categories in more detail. The first one I'm going to talk about is transmission line. So looking at the photograph on the left, you see a very large waveguide. So that is a WR4200 waveguide. So that waveguide operates down in the hundreds of megahertz frequency range. You can see there's a network analyzer in the photo, and then there's some black cables. Those are the RF connectors that connect the analyzer to the fixture, which is the waveguide. And then the waveguide itself actually has a launcher. So that's sort of the front part of the waveguide. And then there's a middle section where you put your material, and then there's a back section where there's essentially a transition that receives energy. So you insert materials into the waveguide, and you can measure the reflection off of that material or the transmission through that material. And then using some physics, determine mu or epsilon, the dielectric or magnetic properties. The photo on the right shows a similar transmission line, but this one is a coaxial waveguide rather than a rectangular waveguide. So the rectangular waveguide is really just a square hollow pipe. The coaxial waveguide is a round pipe with a wire going down the middle, just like the wire coming off the back of your TV for cable TV or something similar. So with a coax, you insert your sample into the coax, and it basically fills the region between the center conductor and the outer conductor. But just like any transmission line, you measure transmission or reflection or both, and then you use that data to then convert into dielectric permittivity or magnetic permeability. Then next sort of class of devices that I mentioned is impedance analysis. This is a low frequency technique. Usually it involves turning a material into some sort of circuit element. So the cartoons on this slide show different examples of making capacitors. So just looking at the guy on the left for a minute, you'll see there's a bottom electrode that's labeled there and a top electrode. And then there's a blue slab there, and that's really the specimen. So it's just a thin sheet of material that you place between the electrodes. And what you have there is a capacitor. Your classic capacitor has two electrodes that are parallel and then some sort of dielectric material in between them. So that's kind of what that fixture is doing there. And you hook it up to an impedance analyzer, a vector voltmeter, or network analyzer, and you can determine the capacitance. And then from the capacitance, you can then calculate the dielectric permittivity. The guy in the middle is an interdigitated electrode setup. Something like that's used often in, say, composites manufacturing or processing, where you want to monitor the state of a resin while it's curing. In that case, you can measure using that interdigitated electrode and determine essentially the dielectric properties as the polymer is turning from a monomer into a polymer. In addition to dielectric properties, which are the example shown here, you can have something that uses a toroidal shaped sample that's essentially a coil. and you can measure the inductance. So again, it's another circuit element, it's an inductor. You measure the inductance, and then you use some basic physics to calculate the magnetic permeability of that inductor. Next set of techniques are cavity fixtures. Cavity fixtures are basically transmission lines that have been truncated in some way so that they resonate. So the idea is you've taken a transmission line. The cartoon shows a rectangular waveguide, and it's been chopped into a short section with irises. So those irises allow you to leak energy in from your network analyzer into the section of waveguide, and then the energy is trapped in there and sort of bounces back and forth. It resonates. And then if you have a hole in the side of your waveguide, you can insert, a small specimen, in this case, a little rod of material. And what that will do is change the resonance. It'll change the frequency. It'll shift the frequency of the resonance. And that usually tells you the real part of the permittivity in this case. And then it'll also absorb or suck energy out of the cavity and therefore change the quality of the resonance. And so that change in the Q, or the quality of the resonance, tells you what the dielectric loss is, or magnetic loss if you're measuring mu. The photo on the right shows a different type of cavity. That one is a strip line transmission line. So a strip line is basically two outer conductors that are wide, and then a skinnier inner conductor. And then this one's been truncated, and it has a couple of loop antennas that allow us to leak energy into the cavity fixture so that it resonates, and it resonates at certain frequencies. And again, you place your material sample in there, and you look how you perturb that resonance, both the frequency and the quality of it. And that allows you to determine mu or epsilon, depending on where you place the material sample. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about free space measurements. This is a photograph of a focus beam system. You can see it has two very large lenses, and those lenses operate very similar to an optical lens on a pair of glasses. But in this case, instead of focusing optical wavelengths, we're focusing microwave energy. So we have some horn antennas that radiate. Those lenses focus that energy onto a material specimen, which is mounted in the middle. And then you can have another lens and horn beyond that on the other side to measure transmission. Or the lens and horn that did the original radiation of the sample can also receive the reflection. So you can measure transmission and reflection, and then again use that to get dielectric properties and magnetic properties. And just like all the other devices, you also have a network analyzer or some sort of microwave system attached to it via some sort of RF cables. So when we do all these various measurement devices, there's a language that we typically use in material measurements, and it's called network scattering parameters. And it's common to network analyzers. Whenever you deal with network analyzers, you deal with these things called scattering parameters. And you create, in a material measurement, you typically have, say, two ports. So if you have a flat sample, you can think of those two ports as the two sides of the sample. And then you can have, two potential signals coming in, one from either side. That would be A1 or A2. And then, of course, you can have signals coming out, B1 or B2. Of course, B1 and B2 are reflected and transmitted signals based on A1 and A2. And then the formalism we use is this 2x2 matrix of what we call S parameters. So you can see there's S11, S12, S21, and S22. And in this formalism, you'll find that S11 and S22 are really the reflection coefficient, depending on which direction you're looking. And S21 and S12 are really the transmission coefficient through a slab of material, depending on which direction you're looking. So I just want to put this slide up here so if you're new to material measurements and you start hearing about these scattering parameters, you'll have some sense of why they exist in the material measurements world. Okay, so that's sort of the basic overview of existing technology and fundamental differences in extrinsic versus intrinsic. Now we're going to talk about some of the new things that are happening in the material measurements world. And really, I have sort of three different, what I call enabling technologies that are helping us to advance the state of the art these days. The first one are microwave spot probes. And these spot probes are sort of specialized antennas that allow us to do free space measurements in a much more compact and ruggedized sense. Now, you saw that how large that focus beam was. Those lenses were about 2 feet in diameter. It's a very awkward system. So if we want to take material measurements, out of the laboratory and take it maybe into a factory where we do manufacturing or out into the field, you're not going to carry around a focus beam. You're going to want something that's a lot more compact and rugged. So we'll talk about microwave spot probes. We'll talk about, second, some extremely portable analyzers. These are sort of very miniaturized one-port analyzers that Copper Mountain's actually been developing over the last couple of years. And it's sort of a game changer in terms of enabling us to take measurements into places where we didn't traditionally do them before. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about are computational electromagnetic codes, and specifically how we use computational codes and the fact that we have very fast computers these days that enable us to do very advanced designs on our material measurements fixtures, and even use these codes to directly convert extrinsic properties into intrinsic ones. So let's start with microwave spot probes. Now, the idea of a spot probe is actually not new. It's been around for a long time. But what's new is something that my company has developed in the last 5 years. And that's the picture here on this photo on the right. It is a spot probe that consists of some metal parts on the inside, and then it's encased in a solid hunk of plastic. And what's different here is, in the past, people would make spot probes by taking a conventional horn and shoving some dielectric material in there. And it worked, but it was less than ideal, somewhat narrow band, and not necessarily rugged. What's different now is because of the computational tools I'm going to talk about in a little bit, we can design these spot probes where we include both the antenna parts and the dielectric all into a single computational model that can be optimized for maximum performance. So this guy, for example, operates very wide bandwidth, 2 to 20 gigahertz with just a single antenna. And it's designed to illuminate a spot a few inches in front of the antenna. So the idea is that you can hover it over your material that you're measuring and use that to measure reflection from that material. Since it's encased in plastic, it's rugged. We mount these guys on robots and occasionally run them into things, and usually the antenna survives. The other thing that often happens is microwave receivers can be very sensitive and subject to electrostatic shock. Because this thing's encased, you're protected against that. You don't have to worry about accidentally touching the positive, negative half of the antenna and burning out your receiver. So as I mentioned, we put these guys on robots. So that's kind of what's new and exciting about these. Is that we can now take measurements out of a laboratory and bring them into a much more ruggedized or harsh environment, such as a manufacturing floor or even outside. So this is a photo of our antenna on an industrial robot. You'll notice that there is a black cable management system. Inside that flexible tube, there's an RF cable. One of the things that I learned early on in my career was that RF cables are something you have to be very careful with. RF cables that operate at in the 2 to 18 gigahertz kind of range are super sensitive. If you bump them, you'll change the phase and even the amplitude of the signal going through them. If you even look at them funny, sometimes they'll change. They're definitely subject to temperature variation. So if you have cycling of the air conditioning, or wide temperature swings, that will significantly change the signal going through that RF cable. So the RF cable has kind of been the bane of my existence for the last couple decades of my career, because of the fact that they cause significant phase and amplitude errors. And so when we're putting out these spot probes on a robot, and now we have to connect it, like I said, to some sort of analyzer. This RF cable is really the primary source of time and money in terms of designing these systems. So how do we deal with cable flex? There are really two solutions. On the plot on the right, I'm showing some measured data, and this measured data is of an EMI absorber that basically is designed to have a maximum absorption right around 14 gigahertz. So it's a logarithmic plot there. I'm showing the reflection coefficient. 0 dB corresponds to 100% reflection, and you can see right around 14 gigahertz, we have a reflection coefficient that's better than, say, 20 dB. Now there are several lines on there. So what we did in this case was we used essentially some fancy software to correct for the cable flex. We developed an algorithm that essentially monitors the extra reflection we get from the antenna, in this case the spot probe that's at the end of the RF cable, and use that to dynamically correct for phase and amplitude shifts that occur because the cable is on a robot being moved around. And so the curves that are plotted in this figure show that. There is a red solid curve that was before the cable was moved. So we carefully set up an experiment where we did a measurement without moving the robot. And so it was sort of an ideal laboratory kind of measurement with no movement in the RF cable, and that's what gave us the red curve. We then moved the robot, basically twisted the cable like you would as it was on the robot, and that is the blue dashed curve. And as you can see, it because of the phase and amplitude change in the cable, it kind of threw off our calibration, and we got something that sort of vaguely resembled what we were expecting to see, but obviously a lot more ripple. But now using this sort of fancy software to correct for the phase and amplitude shift of the RF cable, we took that blue data and essentially were able to reconstruct the proper signal, which is the black dashed dot signal. And so you can see software is a viable solution. Coming up with fancy algorithms are a good way to deal with cable flex. They do work, but it doesn't eliminate the other problem of cables, which is that when you have them on a robot and they're moving around continuously day to day, they wear out. Eventually, these RF cables do break just from flexing. And so the second solution for dealing with cable flex is really the better solution, and that's eliminating the cables in the first place. So that brings us to enabling technology number 2, and that is this sort of emerging product line of portable one-port VNAs. These guys are pictured here are different VNAs that Copper Mountain manufactures. The one on the left starts at 85 megahertz and goes up to 5.4 gigahertz. The next one goes from 1 megahertz to 6 gigahertz. And then you go all the way to the right. The one on the right goes from 1 megahertz to 18 gigahertz. These are all one-port analyzers, full vector analyzers, so they have both amplitude and phase. And really, it's a full full VNA. The only wire that comes off of this guy is a USB cable to connect to the computer that controls it, and a little bit of power. So having something that's this small is sort of a game changer, because it now allows you, instead of having to drag around a rack or a rack-mounted large box, now we have something that's about the size of a cell phone or 2 cell phones back to back that you can attach directly to your measurement fixture, and is now no longer the largest part of your measurement fixture. So I'm going to give you some examples now where we've used the spot probe combined with this super portable pocket analyzer, and kind of give you a sense of some of the new avenues that it's opening up in terms of material measurements. So the photograph here shows a handheld reflectometer system, which you can see the spot probe, and then there's a handle that mounts to the spot probe, and it also holds the vector network analyzer, that 18 gigahertz unit, and then it's sitting on top of a sheet of absorber, some EMI absorber here, some commercial material, and then the plot in the middle basically shows 2 different sheets that we measured with 2 different thicknesses that were tuned really for absorption at 2 different frequencies. So the idea here is now I've got a portable system that I can take out into a factory. So I don't have to, have witness coupons, pulled off of the line, the manufacturing line, and send them over to the laboratory and wait for days or weeks to get the answers. Now I can actually have a material measurement system in situ, on the factory floor, doing measurements as the material is being produced, and I can get instant answers. And so that's a pretty significant paradigm shift because of the fact that we have these portable analyzers combined with rugged probes. And then I've already showed you one picture of a probe on a robot. Here's another one, but this one, of course, has the analyzer directly attached to the back. So now we no longer have to worry about cable management. There's no big RF cable snaking along the robot that's causing ripple in our signal and that we're having to replace periodically because it wears out. It's just a simple USB wire and a power wire coming off. Now in this example, I'm showing the robot scanning in a vertical line just a garden variety fiberglass composite. This fiberglass composite we actually constructed from 2 1/4-inch thick sheets. And when there's those 2 1/4-inch thick sheets are sandwiched together, you get the signal that's shown in the graph there, the black signal, that's relatively flat and boring. And then the next thing we did was we took a thin 18 mil spacer and we created a gap in the top of the 2 sheets right in the middle of them, and we clamped the bottom. So that way we had a variable change of an air gap in the middle of this composite panel, and basically representing a delamination that's internal to the composite, something that you can't see visibly. But as you can see, when we look at the reflection signal over frequency and we do some math to it, we can see a nice strong indication of that delamination that's in the middle of our composite sandwich. So here's an example where you could use this either in a factory or in the field, really, to scan structural dielectric composites. Another example is radomes. Radomes are essentially electromagnetic windows, so they're designed to allow energy to transmit through at some frequency or range of frequencies. So I'm showing a nose cone on an aircraft on the right. The middle image shows a screen grab from our software where we've collected energy using that same handheld system, the probe plus the analyzer. And you can see reflection coefficient as a function of frequency for a fairly heavy-duty radome material here. And you can see it has 2 nulls, one at 6 gigahertz and one at 12 gigahertz. So those nulls are essentially where that material is microwave transparent. So you can use a system like this to test a radome in situ. I mean, you can test it on the aircraft if you wanted to. We also have systems that we've installed in paint booths. You have to paint these radomes, of course, because you want them to match the aircraft. And so the image on the left shows some example data where we measured a composite radome material, and then we applied, just to kind of demonstrate the capability, we applied some painter's tape. So some very thin, like 3.5 mil tape on the backside of the radome to kind of simulate it being painted. And we scanned it. And essentially we used a model of the radome to calculate from the measurement what the thickness of that radome is. So that y-axis on that plot is actually thickness, not reflection. So it's derived from the reflection, but it's thickness. And then you can see that the radome with the painter's tape applied is the blue dashed line. And as you can see where the tape was applied, you can see the thickness is increased by an amount that basically corresponds to the thickness of that tape. So not only can we use this device to look at the performance of the radome, we can actually determine the thickness, and we can even determine the thickness of paint on top of the radome using this kind of technology. And then a final example I'm going to show is the idea, and this is somewhat of a contrived experiment, but the idea here is that in agriculture or in food processing, you often want to know water content. And so here we took the spot probe and just turned it upside down. We have the analyzer underneath, and then we took a sponge and we just put varying amounts of water in that sponge. And so the plot on the left shows essentially just the reflection coefficient as a function of frequency. The dry sponge is the black dashed line. And then we added 1 ounce, 2 ounces, and 3 ounces of water to that sponge, which it absorbed. And then we measured that sponge again each time we added more water. And as you can see, you get a reflection coefficient that is proportional to the amount of water that's in the sponge. So this is just another example of how we now have technology that we don't have to do in the laboratory. We can actually take into a manufacturing facility or out into the field and use to do things anywhere from dielectric properties to water content. Okay, I'm going to talk now about the final enabling technology that sort of is making things very exciting these days in my materials measurement world. And that is the idea of using fast computational electromagnetic codes and computers. So these days, computers are very fast. I mean, the computer in my pocket, my cell phone, is actually amazingly fast. And laptops are fast enough to do very complex computational electromagnetic simulation work. And so you can see here a photograph of our computer cluster, which is really nothing more than a bunch of Macintosh minis that we put onto a rack in our server room, and allows us to basically do lots of calculations on different nodes all at the same time. So it's relatively inexpensive, and cluster computing has become commonplace these days, and computational codes are very mature. And so we have the tools now that allow us to kind of take material measurements and material measurements technology into places where we really hadn't been before. So what does CEM buy? There's really two primary things that we use it for. The first is we use computational tools for our fixture design. So we design waveguides, we design spot probes, we design all these different fixtures for material interacting with materials and measuring materials. And so having these CEM tools allow us to optimize the specific design of these fixtures so that they behave more predictably, that they have a better match to the transmission line, all the various parameters that we're interested in doing in optimizing when we make a material measurement fixture. So that's good. But the real interesting thing that CEM buys us is that now we have something that's fast enough and powerful enough that we can do direct material property inversion. So this is where I'm talking about taking those extrinsic properties, reflection and transmission, and then converting them into intrinsic properties. In the past, we used, simplified physics approximations. And the reason we did that was because we could write analytical formulas. So that's nice, but it restricts us to fairly simple geometries. I mean, it restricted us to, in terms of waveguides, we had to have sort of lowest order modes in a conventional waveguide that had a nice simple equation that we could describe it with, and so it really restricted the design of our material measurement fixtures. But now, since we can do very detailed simulations even on a laptop, CEM can allow us to design much more complicated fixtures, and we can exactly model that fixture. We can even model all the flaws in that fixture. And account for them. So now, instead of having a simplified approximation to invert our properties, we're exactly modeling the material measurement fixture, which actually will give us better accuracy. So CEM basically allows us to make complicated geometries for our fixtures and to solve them with something that a simple physics approximation couldn't do. So I'm going to show you an example of where we've done that recently. And the example is this device we developed over the last couple of years called an RF capacitor. So it's not an RF capacitor because it measures capacitors. We call it an RF capacitor because it combines two different material measurement concepts into the same fixture. It essentially combines impedance analysis, where we take a material and turn it into a capacitor, with transmission line techniques. And that's what the RF sort of means. So in this case, I'm showing a cartoon where we have, of the RF capacitor, and the idea is that we have a vector network analyzer that launches energy into a transition, which then goes into a square coaxial waveguide. But in the square coax, we've replaced the center conductor with the material under test. So in this case, the square center conductor is 3 inches by 3 inches, and now there's actually a 3-inch cube material specimen there. And so there's the RF transmission line aspect of it. But if you look at the fields in your computational code, you'll notice that the E field is predominantly in the direction shown by that arrow. So it looks also a lot like a capacitor. So it's kind of a hybrid between the two. But it's not enough of a capacitor that we can model it using basic physics approximations for capacitors. Those tend to fall apart. And so this is where it's key that we have the CEM code that we can exactly model it. So that's the sort of the principle about how it operates. Here's a photo of the actual device. You can see that in the picture on the right, there's a vector network analyzer, and ironically, you can see it's the smallest part of the fixture now. It's one of the Copper Mountain R54 analyzers. And it's directly connected to a transition, which then goes into what's we call the specimen chamber, and that's really that square coax section I talked about. It's shorted on the top, so essentially energy goes into the chamber, interacts with the material, and then it's reflected back out and measured by that VNA. And then it basically measures cubed shaped specimens like the one shown in the photo on the left. That's a 3-inch cube there. You can also do 2-inch cubes. You can do other geometries. You can do non-cubes, or you can do rectangles and so forth. It's really restricted only to what you can model, and we can pretty much model anything these days. So it's a very flexible system in that sense. Now, the way it works is you take a measurement, you collect S11, which is that reflection S parameter I talked about earlier. And S11 is a complex number, so it has both a real part and an imaginary part, or typically we talk about in terms of phase and amplitude. And then we can essentially create a lookup table. So we run our computational code that exactly models this fixture on our cluster, and we run it for a bunch of different combinations of dielectric permittivity and dielectric loss. In this case, we're using sigma to represent loss. And so we create, and these images just show a couple slices of the lookup table that we create by just running our code over and over again on the cluster. And so now we have a lookup table, and we measure S11, and now it's just a simple matter of taking the S11 and looking in the lookup table to see where it most closely matches what's in the lookup table. And then that tells us what the corresponding dielectric permittivity and loss are. So it's a very fast method. The nice thing about it is that you don't have to have a CEM or computer expert in the lab. All you have to have is software that does this lookup and the data table, the library essentially, to do the lookup in. So it still doesn't change how you operate your lab. You would still have just a regular measurement person or technician in there doing the measurements, and then in this case, the software that they run does this lookup for them based on already calculated model of the fixture. So to kind of show you some example measurements from that fixture, here's an example of a Delrin, which is a basic polymer material. Delrin is interesting in the sense that it's one of the few polymers that actually has a little bit of loss at UHF and VHF frequencies. So you can see this fixture works from below 100 megahertz up to about 800 megahertz. On this plot, there are two sets of lines. The solid lines are real permittivity. The dashed lines are imaginary permittivity. And then there's red and blue lines. The red lines are literature. So that's where someone measured basically Delrin in a conventional technique like a coaxial airline. And I'm comparing to that with this fixture. And so this basically shows that this fixture works in the sense that we agree with conventional methodologies for measuring these materials. So, but so if I can already measure this material in a coax, why would I want to do it in something like an RF capacitor? And honestly, I wouldn't measure something like this in RF capacitor. It's kind of pointless. I've got coax fixtures to do that with. But what the RF capacitor does is allow us to do something that I can't do in a coaxial fixture. So I talked about how this RF capacitor has an E field in a preferred direction, and that's why we call it a capacitor. And so if I have a material that's called anisotropic, and that's a material that has intrinsic properties that depend on direction. So for example, if I might have a dielectric permittivity in the X direction that's 3, and a dielectric permittivity in the Y and Z directions that are 2. So that would be anisotropic. The permittivity depends on direction. That's not something I can measure in a traditional coaxial airline, because in a traditional coaxial airline, the field lines are radial, and so I average over multiple directions. But in this fixture, I have my E field only in one direction, and I can measure an anisotropic material. And so that's what this example here is. This is a cube that was made by laying up different layers of foam. So the light gray layers are a low dielectric, low loss foam. The dark almost black layers are a carbon dipped reticulated foam. So they're lossy, they're resistive. And so if you can see optically that sample is anisotropic, right? There's a parallel direction and a perpendicular direction, and they obviously look different. At microwave frequencies, what you'll find is that parallel to those conductive sheets, you'll see a lot of conductivity. Perpendicular to those conductive sheets, you're crossing them, so you don't really detect a whole lot of conductivity. The dielectric constant will be low loss when you're perpendicular. The plot on the right shows measurements of that cube in the RF capacitor. Again, the solid lines are real. The dashed lines are imaginary permittivity or loss. And you can see there's a red and a black set of curves, and those are the two directions parallel to those sheets. And you can see the imaginary part is very high, which indicates that that material is sort of resistive or semiconductive, really, at these frequencies. And then you can see the blue line, or blue lines, are significantly different. That's where we're measuring with the E field across those sheets, and it's a very different set of dielectric permittivity values. So that's what's sort of interesting, is that now we can measure sort of advanced materials that are laminates, that are these sort of anisotropic layups and things that we couldn't necessarily do very easily in the past with conventional techniques. And just to convince you that that data is for real, of course, I didn't have another low frequency technique that I could measure that cube with to compare to. So instead, I measured it with a high frequency technique, that focus beam system that you saw earlier. And so this data here shows the RF capacitor data at low frequencies on the left side of the plot. And it's just for the parallel direction. And then the blue curves show the real and imaginary permittivity measured with a free space focus beam, obviously at high frequencies at 2 to 18 gigahertz. And as you can see, the curves all nicely line up, and so very much agrees. So to conclude, I gave you an overview of some terminology, and I gave you a review of some of the traditional techniques that we have used over the last few decades for material measurements. And then more interestingly, I talked about sort of three enabling technologies that have sort of emerged in the last few years that are allowing us to take material measurements into areas that we couldn't do before in terms of accuracy and types of materials we can measure, and even the measurement environment. And so those three enabling technologies were the ruggedized probes, the compact VNAs, and then finally the computational tools. Thank you very much.
It looks like we do have a couple questions. Kent asked, how often are S12 and S21 different?
They are generally reciprocal. So in fact, the only time they would be different would be if you had a anisotropic material where you had off-diagonal tensor elements. And I don't know if that's getting into the weeds for you guys, but so it's extremely rare. So in most conventional materials, you almost would never see S21 and S12 different. If they are, then something's probably wrong with your fixture.
Okay, Alexander asks, how do you use an analyzer up to 100 gigahertz to get the reflection coefficient from the frequency more than 100 gigahertz?
I'm not sure I understand the question. You have to, you don't, when you measure at a frequency, you're getting data at that same frequency.
Alexander, if you want to type in and maybe expand on your question, we can try it again. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to type them in before we wrap up here. Okay, if you guys do have any questions, you can reach out to us at support@coppermountaintech.com, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. Looks like Alexander did type up again, use the analyzer up to RF frequency, but you showed the image with almost infrared terahertz frequency.
Which slide? You talking about this slide here? That's in megahertz. So 10 to the 4 megahertz would be 10 gigahertz.
In the beginning.
In the beginning. Okay.
Just to answer the question that popped through about the presentation, you will get a recording of the webinar probably middle of next week.
In the beginning. We're talking about, let's see, it was photos.
He said with the lens.
Yeah, the lens system. I mean, those horns are 2 to 32 gigahertz horns. The analyzer is a 20 gigahertz analyzer. So right now this system is operating up to 20 gigahertz. Of course, you can use millimeter wave horns with modules and go up to terahertz if you want to, or certainly millimeter wave. So that's all dependent on the network analyzer technology that you have available to you. Of course, Copper Mountain does have, millimeter wave network analyzer modules. So you can, and those lenses, by the way, are made from Rexelite, which has a very flat dielectric constant. So they operate well up past 100 gigahertz. So you can use the same fixture to do, millimeter wave, to your heart's content without, all you have to do is sort of reposition the lens and the horn positions a little bit. But otherwise it works the same as it does down at traditional microwave frequencies.
Okay, so I didn't see any more questions pop through. Like I said before, if you have any questions, you can contact us at support@coppermountaintech.com. You can also visit John's company's website at compassTech.com and ask them any questions you may have. I appreciate everyone coming and interacting in the webinar. And just another reminder that we will be sending out this recording, like I said, middle of next week. And thank you to Dr. Schultz for putting this together and doing a great job presenting today. So I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.